Hello, my name is Graeme Daniels. I am a psychoanalyst and author, and this video is the second in a series entitled What's Wrong with Infidelity Treatment, Sex Addiction Treatment, Deceptive Sexuality Treatment. You could add to the mix out of control sexual behavior treatment, problem sexual behavior treatment. The problem is given multiple names in recent years, though generally a lot of the treatment programs and methods fall under the sex addiction headline of the last few generations. And in this video, and the prior one released on YouTube a couple of weeks ago, I am challenging the treatment models that are hegemonic in the field of psychotherapy. As I said, I'm a psychoanalyst. I've been involved in the field of addiction for roughly 30 years, having begun my career as a drug and alcohol counselor in the mid-90s. I've worked in hospital-based settings, group homes for much of the early part of my career and transitioning into private practice. I am the author of two books, and most notably a lead author of a book entitled Getting Real about sex addiction, published by Rowman and Littlefield, now called Bloomsbury. I'm also the author of a paper that has been given an award by the American Psychoanalytic Association called Treatment of an Alcoholic with Substitute Addictions. And these substitute addictions generally pertain to sexuality. And I've been long an observer of sex addiction treatment programs, having also taken part in numerous presentations over the years at various forums. I introduced some of this in the first video. This is the second video to follow up on certain aspects, expand a little bit on some of the themes introduced in the first presentation, particularly around programs that, and this is intended something of a consumer guide, this talk. A lot of programs present themselves to be evidence-based. You'll hear that term or read that term on internet websites and such. Certain aspects of treatment may have credentialing behind them, not terms like psychoanalyst, which requires multiple years of training actually, but certificate programs are typical. The CSAT, which stands for Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. There'll be some confusion because in previous years that designation CSAT has referenced professionals in substance abuse treatment as well, so not to be confused with other CSAT models. Here I might refer to it as Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. Motivational interviewing is probably the type of treatment method that is most extolled in professional circles relating to addiction models. If you're interested in that, it has to do with a method of being non-directive, of utilizing circular questioning, and a stance of provider neutrality, which is at least derived in part from psychoanalytic method. The programs that I am sort of taking aim here tend to be very directive, very instructive, largely pedantic. They make use of some degree of science to explain the phenomena of addiction, and as a result, at least imply that their programs, their methods, their models, whatever they're calling them, are, based in scientific method. The phenomena they're describing may be based in scientific method or based upon scientific phenomena, the pleasure reward systems of the brain that activate dopamine relating to pleasurable activities, the tracking of rates or prevalence of problem behavior may be another area utilizing scientific method. The same might be true to the impact of problem behaviors on impacted others, whether they are dubbed codependents or just betrayed partners, etc. Again, are multiple terms that are commonplace for the impacted others in treatment. And many are said to present with symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, though it's not clear how prevalent the diagnosis is, meaning whether or not people in numbers meet criteria for that. But none of this means that the treatment method itself is grounded in science. The treatment methods of many of these programs that are typically short-term, workshop-oriented, webinar-oriented, retreat-oriented, and so on, their methodology is primarily moral/ethical, as they might put it. They're quite moralistic, actually. And to touch on or reiterate an important point from the first video, they alter the unit of treatment that is traditional in at least individual psychotherapy, particularly if what is presenting, who is presenting for treatment is a couple. So you might wonder, how does the alteration of the unit of treatment, meaning who is the focus of treatment, alter the criteria of what may or may not be deemed a successful treatment episode? Well, reduction of problem behaviors, problem sexual behaviors, for example, might be one criteria, but also reduced symptoms of PTSD is going to be privileged in this kind of model, because the focus becomes the impact upon the partners of those engaged in the problem behaviors. So in a lot of these programs, the unit of treatment has shifted to focus upon the needs of an impacted partner, and they utilize phrases like, typically, she has a right to know, somewhat ambiguous language about weighing in about or receiving information about the prevalence of continued problem behavior, or even secondary factors like whether or not the identified patient, as I referred to, typically him in the first video, is exhibiting progress with respect to, say, empathy for the impacted partner, or other sort of ambiguously defined areas of relational growth. And this contrasts in more generally with the criteria for success in, say, a psychoanalytic or an in-depth model program, where, first of all, the duration and frequency of meetings is not nearly as short-term or defined. It is open-ended to allow for the possibility or likelihood, as many of us would say, of the fluctuations of patient resistance and conscious motivation to change, which we think of as normative, actually, regardless of the presenting problem. Now, historically, it should be said, and something I've covered in my writing, that psychoanalytic or in-depth treatments of addiction particularly have long been contraindicated meaning discouraged, actually, both within and outside of the profession, mostly because what has been privileged are behavioral instructions, behavioral interventions, not insight or interventions per se. And in particular, the prevalence or the existence of the problem behavior at the outset of a treatment episode. Many providers historically have thought that a stability, which might even include abstinence, is necessary in order to begin an insight-oriented therapy. So by implication, insight-oriented treatment is meant to happen down the line. However, there's something of a circular problem here, because I have found, and many others have found, that if individuals don't get to what they might think of as the root of the problem, or if they get to a root of the problem, but it's not really the root of the problem, the tendency is for problem behaviors to return. But the idea is that problem behaviors aren't initially contained, as some suggest, early in behavior. If not eradicated, then that undermines the treatment itself, because the mind is set up, as science will validate, to reinforce the pleasure-seeking behavior. And if the mind has gotten accustomed basically to the pleasure-seeking or painful affect avoiding behaviors, then it won't properly give a new method much of a chance. That is an old and much agreed upon idea. The mind gets habituated to soothing or avoidance, if you like. And the mind finds also substitutes. This is the focus of a lot of my writing, and finds substitutes for the most identified problem behavior in everything from alcohol to drugs to food to work to, in this era, digital preoccupations, social media, and of course, the main focus of these videos, sex. Now, of those, the only one that would be called egosyntonic is work. Egosyntonic, a term derived from psychoanalysis, meaning that the agent of the habit or the addiction is acceptable. It is culturally sanctioned, and the person can do it and be sort of okay with it. This is why workaholism is a kind of, in particular, difficult problem to identify and treat. What I'm going to be adding here and doing a little bit of an illustration of is the idea that guilt as a aimed for emotion in treatment is itself can be a substitute, and that treatment providers, particularly short-term workshop, retreat, psychoeducational models, collude with guilt as a defense. Guilt and the defense of eliciting guilt becomes another kind of superego, as it's dubbed in psychoanalysis. And I think one of the reasons for making these videos is because I think we've gone back to, in popular psychology at least, a kind of just say no attitude towards problem behaviors, whether they are addictive or not, an attitude of more or less shaming or inducing guilt in perpetrators, as they're often dubbed, with the idea that guilt will be, the emotion that will leverage change. That can sometimes be true, but I think it's overstated, vastly overstated as a means of intervention. So, and part of the idea is that patients don't need another harsh superego in their life. And just to sort of cover some basics of psychoanalytic theory, people have heard of terms probably like id, ego, superego. Id, your pleasure-seeking self, your ego, your sense of identity, and who you are, and then superego to represent society, conscience, that which you internalize from your parental figures in life. Now, some would think that people who engage in sexual behaviors and other addictive habits very much do need a harsh superego, or at least a stern, very consistent superego. So they are inclined to make treatment about how you've been a bad person, bad man, thus leading up to being in treatment. There's much less, as I touched on in the first video, of making a female patients feel this way. This is prescribed, I mean, not prescribed, because psychotherapy, among other reasons, is 70% female, and the consumer base for pop psychology literature is estimated to be over at 80%. So the challenging of female sexual behavior is impolitic in the field of psychotherapy. Being a harsh superego, as I put it, would be termed contraindicated in the field because of a premise that I happen to agree with, namely that historically I do think women have been more stigmatized for their, say, sexual freedom than men ever have been, including up until today, I believe. The result in the variously termed fields of infidelity treatment, sex addiction treatment, deceptive sexuality treatment, whatever, is an atmosphere, a mini culture of protecting women via a largely dominant female provider base from the any kind of further stigmatizing. Even, I think, women who are participants in affair-seeking behavior tend to get let off the hook and granted excuses, so to speak, by casting themselves as having been deceived by their male affair-seeking partners. And I think this is probably something that is sort of sanctioned by the providers who might be offering psychotherapeutic treatment to them. Now, if you don't think this is true, if you're a provider or even a consumer and you don't think that the field is exhibiting any tendency toward double standards in this way, then you'd have to consider other alternative arguments for why the field consistently, the field of infidelity and the sex addiction treatment, so consistently aims its messaging at you know, males who engage in the problem behaviors, or perpetrators, as they're sometimes called, and why the field is reticent to term women as perpetrators. Now, I gave at least one other argument in the first video is around the sensitivity towards domestic violence. I think a lot of would-be female perpetrators are not given the same kind of pedantic treatment methods because it is the concern that they are being subject to violence by their male partners. So that would render the "he has the right to know" element of their treatment programs perhaps dangerous. So anyway, to move on to what we think patients needs, and I'll bring up some slides again to revisit some issues. You, as a would-be patient in a treatment program, you need to not be presented simply with a harsh superego that will direct you in a certain way in treatment towards mostly guilt-laden responses. You need actually for your reasoning, your underlying reasoning, to be explored and not to be simply dismissed as an excuse. So just to get one thing on the table here, when I talk about excuses or underlying reasons for problem behavior, addictive or not, I am not talking about standard blaming behaviors like my partner was not giving me enough sex, which is a standard sort of blaming item that is often presented. I agree that is an excuse. I'm talking about more underlying phenomena of shame, actually, as distinct from guilt. And I'll level a word or two towards a finish today about the phenomenon of survivor guilt as well. So why don't I go ahead and bring up some of my slides that I wanted to share today. Getting in here to back to the, let's remember. So I'll have to help with the aspects that are, there we go. So relating a little bit to an addiction concept, so some addiction concepts relating to infidelity and problem sexual behavior, they're relevant. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who presents for treatment of this kind or a psychoeducational lecture of this kind is a sex addict, but the addiction constructs are useful. And let's take one that is often dubbed as a sine qua non, meaning the indicator of addiction, that one is out of control. I'm going to indicate here that being out of control has with it conscious and unconscious motivations. An individual doesn't want to be out of control. It is, the conscious tends to think of that, and the ego replies with, oh, that is, I'm out of control, I am childish, I am immature and possibly criminal. It has a negative connotation, but being out of control also connotes being childlike and free, and that has an unconscious positive inclination. What I'm suggesting here is that one of the underlying motivations for affair-seeking behavior is to actually be out of control. And what a person is experiencing is an internal conflict between the value of being a child, even beyond that to be parented, which means also feeling disempowered, versus the supposed virtues of growing up and being empowered, which also comes with it things like responsibility. Now, if this is conflict, what many human beings do with a conflict is engage in a split, an internal split, where in the first experience, that of being disempowered, is denied, but will possibly be acted upon. That's where the term acting out comes from. The idea of a person acts upon that which is denied, particularly thoughts and feelings. Now, this leads to a kind of compromise behavior. I'm going to cast the problem behaviors as a compromise because they offer an illusion of control, an illusion that is later thought of as an illusion and regretted in the aftermath of the behaviors, particularly if a person is getting caught in these behaviors. Now, how this might contrast with, again, some of the programs that I critique in this field is that a lot of short-term programs think that guilt is what is being denied, and as a result, they privilege awareness of guilt, the conscious inducing of guilt in patients, so as to further the treatment. So to come to this, it's actually, again, I've suggested this is the moral imperative of such programs. It does have its pedigree in psychoanalytic theory as well. This term here I've got up on this slide called the depressive position refers to mourning. It actually is based upon the psychoanalytic figure of a woman named Melanie Klein, who was prominent in the onset of the object relations school of psychoanalysis in the 1930s through the 1940s. Melanie Klein is perhaps the second most famous figure in psychoanalysis after Sigmund Freud. Her idea of mourning is one that is borrowed, and consciously or not, by many treatment providers and integrated more or less into what drives a treatment model. It's the idea that in a healthy development, an original hate, sadism, or anxiety, Klein termed it the paranoid schizoid position of life, yields to love and remorse. Now, the question is, in the context in which I'm talking about, infidelity treatment, sex addiction treatment, is being caught by itself sufficient to leverage a passage from hate, sadism, and anxiety into love and remorse? Do you begin turning the tide and start taking responsibility and feeling remorse upon being caught? Well, an argument in some programs is not so much that the idea of being caught will leverage what they might term as appropriate guilt, but learning the extent of harm that will elicit guilt. If you're aware, for example, as I saw on a news report last night, that lots of people have been killed in recent years in, say, Syria. That is one thing, but if you watch a video, if you were to visit, say, the city of Damascus and walk through the bomb-shelled streets and the ruins of that once great city, then you'd experience and learn on another level about the impact of the violence upon Syria. So the idea in sex addiction or in short-term infidelity treatment programs is cut from the same cloth. The exposing the individual to the extent of the harm, and the extent of the harm in particular relating not just to the sexual behavior, say infidelity, but also the lying about it. It's often dubbed gaslighting. And that if you learn your partner has manifested multiple symptoms of PTSD as a result of that, and that the effect is long-standing, then that will elicit appropriate guilt, and that guilt will be the lever of change. These programs rely on the idea that denial of guilt equals a kind of denial of reality and maturity and relationship itself, particularly because of the presumption, at least, that people who are prone to habitual behavior, sex addiction behavior, objectifying behavior, don't think in terms of relationship. Now, that idea of denial of guilt equaling denial of reality is perhaps at odds with the problem of guilt equaling self-effacement. Now, it is commonplace in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, it's not really a division on the next point, that depression is healthy. I'll say that again. Depression, at least to a certain degree, can be healthy. Why? Because it fosters a tolerance and responsibility for loss if it is experienced in tandem with the idea that all is not lost. So this is a healthy experience of depression. To experience loss, loss being a basic of life, loss is a reality, but loss pertaining to one's own behavior is a unique aspect of that. And that is more or less the treatment goal in most programs that address addictions and particularly short-term programs and, say, sex addiction or affair-seeking behavior. The question becomes whether or not treatment demands an extreme sacrifice, whether it fosters something that may be deemed oppressive, too much of a loss, if you like. The goal is the development of ambivalence, ambivalence being the experience of mixed thoughts and emotions, which is healthy and normative and developmental, as opposed to what I termed earlier a split, a subset of a primitive defense called splitting, commonly referred to as black and white, us versus them thinking. And it has the idea that you would experience people as a whole. If you want to think of, say, a caregiver as what's a whole sort of representation of an early caregiver, somebody who will feed you, but will also make you wait. Now, this presentation of what is sort of the goal of like a typical treatment program, and it's, it's echoes of not just moralism, but also psychoanalytic theory to some extent. It also clues in as to why the programs are dominantly aimed at men and not women. Because as previously mentioned, for women, I think the perception is that infidelity treatment, or certainly sex addiction treatment, will demand too much of a sacrifice for them because they've already been stigmatized. They've already lost, historically at least, their sexual freedom. So this is the aspect of treatment programs that treats individuals as really representatives of social groups. So women are generally not the focus of intervention, and women are generally, if you read sort of pop literature about sex addiction treatment for women or infidelity treatment that is focused on women, and particularly if you read studies that are about women, they tend to focus relational aspects of women's behavior. Women are dissatisfied in their marriages, or they are attempting to take revenge against their committed partners, husbands or whatever, who have themselves, it is implied, also engaged in, say, affair-seeking behaviors. So this would undercut a treatment that aims at eliciting guilt if what your dominant feeling in a relationship is revenge-seeking behavior. Revenge-seeking behavior or responses to dull marriages or would not be deemed sanctionable excuses from male participants, at least in part because the presumption is the prejudice with male participants in treatment that they do not require, such relational motivations in order to engage in the problem behaviors. It is generally deemed that the essentialist idea that men are naturally promiscuous is the reason for the affair-seeking, or rather problem sexual behaviors. This is, these are the reasons why infidelity or sex addiction treatment is dominantly aimed at men. You'll even hear of practitioners who will admit they don't have any female sex addict patients, or that they don't have any impacted partners that are male patients. I've spoken to even colleagues, people whose work I respect, who run, say, women's support groups for impacted partners of sex addiction, and they will not even admit would-be male participants. So next point, this also gets into the idea of what is a trigger. A word trigger is used particularly in addiction treatment circles, 12-step circles, and so on, as a word that interestingly conflates notions of sexuality and aggression, trigger connoting the gun. And triggers are often said at first to be environmental and explicitly, sexual in nature. So you see an attractive woman in the street, an attractive ad on your computer screen in a magazine, whatever. But there's also the idea, somewhat ingrained in treatment circles and 12-step circle fellowship circles as well, that there is an emotional aspect. So, indeed, a relational aspect, even to, men's acting out behavior, in which sex or problem sexual behaviors is understood to be a cover-up, a defense, if you like, and, as I would argue, a substitute for a conflictual dilemma. And the idea of treatment is to get at what this is defending against, if this is an accepted idea, and again, an idea that has its antecedents in psychoanalytic theory. So the sex covers up anxiety, and anxiety that could pertain to work or home. And anxiety in particular, if it relates to failure or humiliation. So here I'm talking about shame. And in conceptual terms, this is often what might be termed a narcissistic wound. Narcissism being about, among other things, grandiose activities, perhaps guilt-inducing activities that conceal or obscure an underlying vulnerability. And what's typical is for individuals who feel a failure or humiliation to defend against such experiences with rage. But the rage isn't necessarily explicitly a violent behavior or verbally abusive behavior necessarily. Many addictive behaviors constitute a kind of compromise, and there's a lot of pedigree in psychoanalytic theory around this idea. Alcohol, today video gaming, lots of activities that are subduing of an intense feeling, but not necessarily a dominantly sexual experience. And the compromised behavior, because it has some negative effect on self, but also others, whether that's neglect or betrayal, for example, it elicits guilt. But guilt here is by implication and by, I think, a lot of people's definitions of the notion of what guilt is. We're talking about definitions that cross thresholds of the professional, the spiritual, the average layperson's idea of what guilt is. Guilt relative to shame is an empowered experience, which is why it can be mustered as a defense, and why it's important for treatment programs, therefore, not to excessively collude with guilt, particularly performative guilt. I'm demonstrating how bad I feel about what I've done, because it is obscuring of underlying feelings of shame. Guilt here I'm presenting as the unconscious price of feeling renewed power and strength versus weakness. A person feels bad for what they have done. They rather feel bad for what they have done versus feeling weak, small, and inadequate. The initial trigger if you like, of the problem or so-called addictive behavior. All right. So the idea, of course, in what I'm terming sort of morality-based, treatment programs is reparation. The idea to repair the wound, the betrayal, and here guilt is presented as reparative, a prospective deterrent. Here comes in sort of, I think, the just say no, and if you are reminded of the negative consequences of your behavior, it'll stop you from doing it in the future. People just have to think about how often that appears to fail, to be skeptical of such a focus. And so guilt is presented as a therapeutic solution. It's also sort of suggested by the term appropriate guilt. Versus the concept that guilt is a point on an addictive / habitual cycle, and that the relationship guilt has with defenses against guilt, or the interchangeability or the interchanging of guilt and shame, is cyclic. And the guilt is unconsciously preferred because relative to shame, it is an empowered feeling. Programs that seek to elicit optimal guilt, therefore, in my opinion, often misfire, supporting a defense which is anti-therapeutic, because guilt is seeking the stronger position against shame, an underlying feeling of weakness and vulnerability, our original experience of being small, I would suggest. So the aim of treatment, got to go back a slide, I'm not yet done, of treatment, rather in a psychoanalytic or in-depth model as I'm presenting, is that of awareness seeking, and it aims at an understanding of a dialectical conflict between our desire to be a child versus our desire to be growing up, being aware of the conflict between the desire to grow up and the desire to not grow up, versus simply splitting and saying to oneself, it's time for me to grow up. No kidding. It's just not how it typically always works. So, lastly, I'll comment on one aspect of guilt that bears a mention, because this idea of guilt replacing shame, of guilt serving as a defense against shame. I'm talking about people who go into programs, particularly short-term programs, where they can more or less run out the clock if it's a retreat, a single-day lecture or workshop, or even, say, a 28-day rehab comes to mind, kind of programs that I used to work in once upon a time. You can act guilty. You can declare guilty. You can even make disclosures about slip behavior, with the idea perhaps that it's going to get reported to your impacted other, because, to invoke some of the concepts that are presented, they have a right to know. They get to weigh in on your treatment, which means a good likelihood that they will be informed of whatever you share in your presumably otherwise confidential treatment program. Now, again, the leveraging of guilt is, I'd say, dominant in both infidelity and addiction-oriented treatments. And people resist the expression of shame, and they prefer to exhibit guilt. So there's a kind of alliance, an unknowing alliance between the guilt-ridden participant in therapy and the treatment providers, who are, many of them, at least somewhat offended on behalf of the impacted others. They have their own sort of negative attitudes towards the participants in treatment. But there's also another kind of resistance, another kind of guilt that is also about not growing up. And it's the guilt that growing up will do a kind of psychological harm to your forebears. In common speak, in culture, this is dubbed survivor guilt, which is often invoked as a concept to represent the plight of the soldier, the plight of the impoverished individual who has done well in life and left behind his friends from the old neighborhood, so to speak, or her neighborhood if it's a girl. Survivor guilt can manifest as a resistance to growing up, and itself can be, I accept, an underlying reason for participating in self-destructive behaviors, addictive behaviors, or just the destructive behaviors that is an affair-seeking behavior. Now, I won't go too much into the depths of this, but this is rooted in the psychoanalytic theory of Oedipal conflict, which has at its heart the idea that one is not supposed to displace or usurp the father, or if you like, the mother, because the caretaking object figure is the idea here, not to overly gender this concept. It can elicit guilt to grow up, to get better, to supersede the people you love. This is often an unconscious reason for engaging in problem behaviors. You won't find this in most books on the subject or most videos on the subject, this material of infidelity treatment, deceptive sexuality treatment. Again, I won't go through the plethora of terms that are used. We're living in an age where what gets sold are sometimes books, often workbooks, that are variably presented as expert-driven. I thought I'd make one or two sort of recommendations. I do like Esther Perel's State of Affairs book from 2017. And I am a big fan of a book by a doctor on the East Coast by the name of Lance Dotis. There's a written book called The Heart of Addiction. There are some good workbooks out there. A workbook by someone by the name of Andrew Susskind is available, and I think a good book for those engage in problem sexual behaviors. I will say again, as a caveat, look for providers, particularly providers presenting themselves as experts, to see whether their material, if there's some evidence that it has been, first of all, distributed by a major publisher, and secondly, that it has been reviewed by a peer-reviewed professional process. And that if it's claiming to be a bestseller, check out what are the sources of that information. I would think it fascinating if, for example, workbooks which require or call for people to sort of write into the workbook, they're meant to be used as a workbook, rather like a kid's workbook in school. If, for example, they were not on the New York Times or USA Today or Amazon bestseller, but rather on something like audio.com, which would be comical because that's about audiobooks. That's about the book being listened to, not written into. So that's about it for today and for this presentation about what I think is wrong with particularly short-term model sex addiction, deceptive sexuality, infidelity treatment. I'll stick with those labels for now, and with a smidgen of what an in-depth treatment would alternatively allow. So let's stop sharing. So once again, thank you for listening. My name is Graeme Daniels. I am the lead author of Getting Real About Sex Addiction, published in 2022 by then Rowman and Littlefield, also now known as Bloomsbury. And I have a podcast series by the same title, Getting Real About Sex Addiction. So thanks again for listening for this presentation.